The card is pale and stiff beneath your left hand, with the faint powdery feel of cut paper that has been stacked through the night in a room where the stove has gone low. Near your wrist, a shallow tray holds the buttons, small black moons of horn and pressed glass and shell, each one catching the lamplight in a slightly different way as the morning gathers at the window. The needle rests between your fingers, already threaded and drawn once across the beeswax, and the thread has that quiet firmness that makes it behave. Outside, BRNO is not fully awake yet, though the mills have begun their soft iron muttering along the river, and somewhere a cartwheel slips over a damp stone. In the 1890s, the city still carries its older name in many mouths, Brünn, and its newer industrial confidence in almost every street, where cloth, wool, dye, steam, and paper seem to have found their own weather. You sit at a work table that might be in a small finishing room behind a shop, or in a tenement kitchen hired out by the dozen, and your task is simple enough to be overlooked by almost everyone. You are carding buttons, which does not mean combing wool, as the word does in other trades, but fastening each little piece to a printed card so it can travel neatly into a drawer, a haberdasher's counter, a tailor's kit, or a woman's sewing basket. The card has faint blue lines, and the maker's name is printed at the top in careful letters, with room below for rows of buttons that must appear even, useful, and modestly pleasing. Nothing about the work asks to be admired too loudly, but everything about it rewards steadiness, because a crooked row can make good buttons look poor. The first custom is to smooth the card with the heel of the hand before the first stitch, not because the paper truly needs polishing, but because the hand needs to meet the morning. Older carders say you should feel the grain of the paper before you trust it, and in BRNO's dry winter rooms, paper can curl at the edges or pull too tightly against thread. So you pass your palm once, twice, across the blank places, and the little motion becomes a greeting, a way of telling the card and the fingers that the day has begun. Beside the cards, a strip of linen lies folded, darkened by use and faintly shining where wax and dust have gathered in the weave. You draw the thread across beeswax, then pinch it through the linen, and this small habit keeps the thread from fraying while also laying down the first rhythm of the shift. Some women used beeswax from church candles when they could get it cheaply, some used plain yellow wax bought in scraps, and some saved tiny ends from household sewing because nothing in such work was too small to have a purpose. The buttons are not poured onto the table in a careless heap, because the carder's eyes would soon tire from the glitter and sameness. They are tipped into a shallow dish, often a saucer with a chipped rim or a wooden tray darkened by years of fingers, and then turned gently with the side of the needle. In that turning, you learn to see which buttons have 4 holes and which have 2, which ones have a small burr along the edge, which ones are too proud, too flat, too pale, or too dull for the card before you. In the 1890s, BRNO's larger factories were known for cloth rather than buttons alone, but a city of wool and tailoring needs a world of smaller trades to orbit it. Fabric leaving a loom asks for cutting, cutting asks for stitching, stitching asks for fastenings, and fastenings ask to be counted, presented, and carried without confusion. A button carder lived in that narrow, practical space between making and selling, where goods became legible to a shopkeeper's hand and trustworthy to a customer's eye. The room smells of paper, wax, cold ashes, and a trace of machine oil brought in on someone's apron from a larger workshop nearby. There may be coffee, though it is thin, and there may be yesterday's bread, wrapped in cloth and resting near the stove where it will soften a little by mid-morning. You work while the city loosens itself into motion, and the repeated pass of needle through paper begins to sound almost like breath, a tiny in and out, a modest sewing that asks only to be even. One helpful custom, remembered in small workshops wherever buttons were put up for sale, was to begin with the middle pair and not the corner pair. The carder would set the center buttons first, lightly, so the rows could spread outward from a known place, rather than creep away from the printed guide. It is the kind of rule that seems fussy until you have filled many cards and watched how a tiny slant, ignored at the start, becomes a visible leaning by the end. You place the first button at the center of the top row, hold it with the nail of your left thumb, and bring the needle up from the back. The paper gives with a soft, dry resistance, and the thread slides through, waxed enough not to snarl, though not so stiff that it cuts the card. You pass through 2 holes, then across the back, then through again, not making a garment stitch but a selling stitch, firm enough to hold and simple enough for a buyer to remove without annoyance. There was kindness in that balance, because a button card was never meant to keep its buttons forever. It had to hold them securely through packing, dust, handling, and a quick inspection of shop customers. Yet it also had to surrender them easily when somebody needed to mend a coat or finish a dress. So the carder did not knot each button like a secret. The carder fastened it with a little respect for the unknown hands that would later undo the work. Another custom was to keep the knots at the back low and tidy, because shopkeepers sometimes turned cards over before buying a batch. The front told one story, neat rows and printed promises, while the back told another, more intimate story of the worker's patience, economy, and care. A good back did not have loops that could catch, knots that bulged, or thread tails standing out like dry grass, and a good carder could make the hidden side nearly as orderly as the visible one. In the dimmer months, when daylight came late and left early, the carder's lamp was often placed to the left if the right hand held the needle. This kept the working shadow from falling over the buttonholes, and it spared the eyes more than most people would notice. Some households kept a scrap of pale paper behind the lamp to throw back a little more light, not a grand reflector, just a practical whiteness that turned a small flame into a larger kindness. You can feel the custom in your shoulders as much as in your hands, because the lamp does not force you to lean so far forward. The buttons gleam without flashing, the card's printed lines appear, disappear, and appear again as the needle moves, and the whole table becomes a small island of work. Behind you, someone stirs the stove and sets a kettle down with a careful sound, and the room accepts the noise without waking fully from its hush. A button carder's day was measured not only by hours, but by filled cards, sorted trays, finished bundles, and the slow descent of thread from a spool. The work might be paid by the piece, and piecework gives every small delay a faint weight, though in the best rooms, the workers soften that weight with shared habits. They passed needles to one another already threaded, they checked a crooked row before it became too late, and they kept a little tin for broken buttons, so the loss could be shown and not blamed on careless hands. In BRNO, where Czech and German words cross daily in markets, mills, stairwells, and shops, the same practical thing might have more than one name depending on who asked for it. A wholesaler might speak one language at the counter and another at home, while a worker might know the shape of instructions before knowing every formal word. On a carding table, however, the work itself spoke plainly, because 12 dark coat buttons in 2 rows or 6 pale shirt buttons in a narrow line were understood by anyone who had mended clothing in winter. The cards themselves carried small customs too, and not all of them were written down by clerks or remembered by factory owners. Dark buttons were often placed on lighter cards, while pearl buttons looked cleaner against tinted paper, and brass or metal buttons needed enough space not to rub each other dull in transit. Some cards had little printed circles, some had only guidelines, and some depended entirely on the carder's eye, which became a measuring tool more patient than a ruler. You learned to measure with the width of your thumb, the span between 2 knuckles, the shadow cast by a button at the lamp's edge, and the memory of the last card you finished. The body keeps such measurements quietly, storing them without ceremony, until the hands know where to put the next button before thought has crossed the room. There is a calmness in being trusted by repetition, because the work that once felt delicate begins to unfold with an almost breathing steadiness. Another helpful custom was to turn every 7th or 8th card over and inspect the back, not as a punishment, but as a reset. Eyes grown used to the front can stop seeing small faults, while the back reveals looseness, bunching, and uneven thread with patient honesty. A carder might run a finger across the back, feeling for loops or proud knots, and then return to the front with renewed care, as though the card had quietly explained what it needed. In a larger finishing shop, the tables might be long and scarred, with several workers seated along them and trays arranged in repeating islands of shell, horn, glass, and metal. There would be a senior woman or a trusted hand who knew the orders, knew the merchants, and knew which cards should be packed first for the station. She might say very little, because the room's order was already visible in how the materials were placed, with incoming buttons at one end, blank cards in the middle, and finished bundles resting under a light board to keep them flat. The board was another small custom, and a useful one, especially on damp mornings when paper had a mind of its own. Finished cards were stacked face to face or back to back depending on the buttons, then placed under a clean plank or weighted pasteboard so the slight pull of thread would settle evenly. By evening, the cards would lie flatter and the rows would look calmer, as though even the paper had accepted the day's work and chosen to rest. When people imagine industrial cities, they often imagine the largest sounds first: the hammer, the loom, the engine, the whistle, and the trampling of many boots at a gate. But beneath those sounds were quieter occupations that made the loud work usable, and button carding was one of these nearly silent trades. It did not roar or smoke or shake the floor. It sat near the edge of manufacturing, converting handfuls of small objects into something countable, saleable, and ready for ordinary life. You can imagine the morning order brought in wrapped with string, perhaps from a supplier who handled many kinds of notions: buckles, hooks, eyes, pins, and buttons in dull brown packets. The paper label names, sizes in a clerk's hand, and the buttons inside have been counted in gross and half gross, large numbers that become less abstract once they sit in a tray. Your work is to divide the abundance into small, believable groups, each card a little promise that the buyer will find exactly what the printed face says is there. To keep counting from becoming sharp and tiresome, some carders used a soft-speaking custom, not calling numbers loudly, but murmuring the row under the breath as the needle moved. 1, 2, 3, 4. Not as a school lesson and not as a clock, but as a thread of attention passing through the fingers. When conversation rose in the room, the counting might vanish inward, held only in the muscles, and when the room quieted again, the little murmur returned like rain. There were customs about mistakes too, because mistakes are part of any work done by hand, especially work done near a window in winter or after a long day. A button sewn in the wrong place was not ripped away in irritation if the paper was fragile. It was eased loose with the needle point, the thread clipped carefully, and the hole sometimes hidden beneath the corrected position. If the card could not be saved, it went into a pile for cheaper use, practice, or household scraps, because paper still had value after disappointment. The carder learned that haste often took more time than patience, which is one of the oldest lessons in any quiet trade. A tangled thread could swallow the minutes that was supposedly saved by rushing, and a crooked row could force a whole card to be remade just when the kettle had boiled and the hands had grown warm. So the best workers moved without hurry, not slowly in the sense of laziness, but smoothly, with no wasted snapping, no sudden jerks, and no anger spent on thread. At midday, the light in BRNO changes, especially in streets where industrial soot and winter clouds soften the sun into a kind of silver dust. The windows show more than they brighten, giving back a faint reflection of bent heads, moving hands, the dark line of a stovepipe, and the pale rectangles of cards laid out to be filled. Somewhere below, a vendor calls, a door shuts, and a child runs past with the quick, uneven steps of someone carrying an errand too large for their pocket. Your meal is simple, because the work does not ask for a feast, only enough warmth to carry the afternoon. Bread, perhaps soup if you are at home, perhaps a bit of cheese, perhaps coffee stretched thin and sweetened when there is sugar enough for it. You keep the food away from the cards, another custom older than any posted rule, because grease spots travel farther on paper than they should, and one careless crumb can make a white card look handled before it has even left the room. After eating, many carders rub their fingertips with a dry cloth before returning to shell or glass buttons, because a clean shine helped sell the card. A fingerprint on a dark horn button might not matter much, but on pale mother of pearl, it could catch the light and seem like a flaw. So the cloth passed from finger to finger, and the little buttons were touched as little as possible, lifted by their edges, nudged by the needle, and settled into their places with care. Mother-of-pearl buttons were their own small weather, cloudy and luminous, never identical, showing faint greens, creams, pinks, and greys depending on how the light entered them. They could make a plain card look almost watery, like a river seen through mist, and a carder might turn them gently before stitching so the prettiest side faced outward. Not every button deserved such attention, and not every order paid for it, but the habit survived because beauty often slips into work through small, unofficial doors. Horn buttons felt warmer and quieter, absorbing light instead of returning it, and they suited coats, waistcoats, practical dresses, and garments that would live close to weather. Their holes could be uneven, and the needles sometimes found resistance where the drilling had left a tiny roughness. When that happened, you did not force the stitch, because forcing could split thread or crack a cheap button. You turned the button, found the cleanest passage, and let the needle take the path it preferred. Pressed glass buttons had a cooler touch, and if they were black, they could look deeper than their size, holding the lamp flame in a tiny hard reflection. Some were faceted, some plain. Some meant to imitate jet for morning clothes, though in everyday trade the imitation and the fashion often traveled without much comment. These buttons needed carding in straight rows, because their shine made disorder visible, and a line of black glass set neatly on pale card had a solemn, tidy grace. One custom that helped tired eyes was to change the color of the work after a run of difficult cards, whenever the order allowed it. A batch of black buttons might be followed by pale ones, or large coat buttons by small shirt buttons, not for pleasure exactly, but for relief. The eye, like the hand, can grow cramped from sameness, and a small change in size or color can return attention without breaking the deep calm of the day. The afternoon is when conversation may become softest, because the morning's stiffness has passed and evening is still far enough away not to press too hard. Someone speaks of the price of coal. Someone mentions a cousin working in a cloth mill. Someone remembers a shopkeeper who always inspects the backs of cards as though he were reading private letters. The talk rises and falls, never needing to be clever, because in a room of repeated work, companionship is often made from ordinary sentences resting beside ordinary motions. In Brünn's industrial neighborhoods, many families carried more than one kind of work under the same roof, and a table might serve breakfast, sewing, carding, homework, and accounts in a single day. A child old enough to sort, but not old enough to sew, might separate large buttons from small ones, or gather broken pieces into a dish. This was not the romance of craft so much as the practical weaving of household time, where paid work and home life shared the same light, the same stove, and sometimes the same silence. Children were sometimes warned not to play with the cards, because the rows looked tempting, like little soldiers or sweets arranged for a shop window. But they were also taught to see the difference between waste and usefulness, between a button with a cracked rim and one with only a dusty face. In such small lessons, work customs moved from one pair of hands to another, not through manuals, but through watching, correcting, and being allowed to help when help would not ruin the order. The carder's chair mattered more than the merchant knew, and many workers had their own ways of making a hard seat bearable. A folded shawl, a cushion flattened by long use, a footrest made from a scrap of wood, or a box placed at just the right distance could save the back across many hours. The custom was not comfort in any grand sense. It was the practical mercy of arranging the body so the hands could continue without complaint. Needles were kept with nearly ceremonial attention because a dull or burred needle turned smooth work into irritation. Some carders pushed the needle through a scrap of wool cloth between cards, partly to wipe it, partly to feel whether the point still entered cleanly. If a needle began to catch the thread or tear the paper, it was set aside for rougher tasks, because the best needle belonged to the best cards, and the best cards were the ones most likely to be examined in daylight. There was also the matter of thread color, which seems small until you notice it. White thread on white card looked clean but could soil. Dark thread could disappear behind black buttons but show too strongly at the back. Grey or tan thread often behaved politely between extremes. A careful carder learned the merchant's preference, the customer's likely eye, and the practical fact that thread should do its duty without asking to be seen. When the order called for matched sets, the custom was to lay out an entire card before stitching, so differences could be noticed while there was still time to change them. Buttons poured from the same packet were not always twins, especially when made from natural materials or low-cost molds that had served through many batches. A slightly smaller button placed at the end of a row might pass unnoticed, but one placed in the middle would disturb the whole card, and the carder's eye learned to catch such disturbances before the needle made them permanent. The laying out itself is peaceful, almost like setting a table for very small guests. Each button is placed, moved, turned, and compared, while the card waits beneath them, pale and patient. When the row finally looks right, you begin fastening from the center outward, and the buttons stop being loose objects, becoming instead a single presented thing ordered by thread, paper, touch, and habit. By late afternoon, the room has warmed enough for the wax to soften slightly, and the thread moves differently through your fingers. The card edges no longer feel cold, the buttons no longer startle the skin, and the stove gives a dull red comfort when someone opens it to add coal. Outside, the city smoke leans along the roofs, and the windows hold the color of pewter while the lamps inside prepare to take over from the fading day. The strangest customs are often the most useful because they come from problems so small that no outsider would bother naming them. In some carding rooms, workers tapped a finished card lightly against the table edge, not to test strength in any formal way, but to hear whether a loose button clicked out of place. A secure card gave a soft, single sound. A careless card sometimes answered with a tiny rattle, and the ear caught what the eye had missed. Another custom was to keep a dark cloth and a pale cloth near the table, using each as a background when sorting difficult buttons. Pale shell showed better on dark cloth, black glass showed better on pale cloth, and mixed packets revealed their hidden differences when spread across the right ground. It was a simple trick, and perhaps no one thought of it as clever, but it saved the eyes and made the finished cards more honest. The habit of honesty runs quietly through this work, because every card carries a count. If the printed face says 6, there must be 6. If it says 12, there must be 12. If the buttons are meant for cuffs, coats, shirts, or dresses, the card must not deceive the hand that reaches for it. The carder may never meet the buyer, but the buyer will one day trust the card, and that little chain of trust passes through your table like thread through paper. Even the scraps had customs, because nothing in a working room disappears without being considered. Thread ends were gathered so they would not cling to finished cards. Broken buttons were counted separately, bent needles went into a safer container, and misprinted cards sometimes became stiffeners, labels, or practice pieces. A child might be given a spoiled card and a few unusable buttons to imitate the grown hands, learning not only the motion but the quiet pride of placing things where they belong. As evening comes closer, the pace often changes without anyone announcing it. The body knows how many cards remain. The senior worker knows which bundle must be tied before the messenger arrives, and the room settles into a concentration deeper than talk. This is not urgency, exactly, but a shared narrowing of attention, like the way a street grows quieter when snow begins, and everyone keeps doing what they were doing with a little more softness. You draw the thread through the final button of a row, feel the waxed line settle, and turn the card over to fasten the back with a low, flat knot. The knot is made close to the paper, then pressed with a thumbnail, and the cut end is kept short enough not to catch. When you turn the card front again, the row sits evenly, the printed border remains clean, and the buttons look as if they have always belonged there. Finished cards are stacked according to order, size, and kind, and the stacks have their own small beauty, pale edges aligned, buttons making slight hills beneath the top sheet. A strip of paper is wrapped around each bundle, or the cards are tied with string, and a label may be slipped beneath the knot. The string should be firm but not crushing, because too much pressure can bend the card or mark the buttons, while too little lets the stack loosen and shuffle during its journey. The journey might be short, only to a BRNO shop where drawers smelled of wood and dust and cloth, or longer by rail to a town whose customers would never know where the buttons were carded. Goods moved through the empire in practical steps, from maker to finisher, from finisher to wholesaler, from wholesaler to shop, and from shop to the private work basket. Somewhere far from your table, a person repairing a sleeve would lift one of these buttons from its card, and your careful stitch would release it without a struggle. There is something restful in work that prepares small usefulness for strangers. You do not need to know the coat, the dress, the shirt, or the hand that will hold the needle later. You only need to make the card trustworthy now. The future is not yours to manage, but the row before you is, and in that modest boundary, there is a calm kind of freedom. In the 1890s, when machines had already changed so much of industrial life, button carding still kept a place for the hand. Machines could stamp, cut, drill, press, print, and pack. But the final presentation of small mixed objects often benefited from fingers that could notice a burr, a mismatch, a thread snag, a cracked edge. The work was humble, sometimes underpaid, sometimes unseen. Yet it preserved an attentive knowledge that belonged to the body and could not be fully written into a ledger. The customs that helped were not grand inventions, and no monument would be raised for the center first row, the lamp at the left, the cloth for sorting, or the habit of checking the back. They were the little agreements by which repetitive work became bearable and accurate, the shared wisdom of people who spent long hours with paper, thread, and small hard objects. Such customs are often the truest history of a job because they show what the work felt like after the novelty had vanished and only the daily doing remained. The table is quieter now, though not finished, and the lamp has begun to show its flame more clearly against the window. Your fingers smell faintly of wax and paper, and the needle has made a small polished place where it rests against your skin. Another blank card waits beneath your hand, with its printed lines ready to receive the next row, and the buttons in the tray shift with a soft, dry sound as you draw them closer. The next card begins with a small adjustment of the tray, no more than the width of 2 fingers, because the easiest work is the work placed just where the hand expects it. You have learned not to reach far for every button, since 1,000 small reaches can tire the shoulder more than one heavy lift. So the tray comes close, the blank cards stay square to the table edge, and the spool sits in a chipped cup where it can turn without rolling away into shadow. Some carders kept the spool in a cup with a scrap of wool beneath it, and the custom looks odd until you hear the difference it makes. Without the wool, the spool knocks lightly against the cup, a dry little clicking that grows larger as the day lengthens, while the soft scrap lets the thread unwind in near silence. In a room where many hands are working, even a tiny sound can become a companion or a nuisance, and the old workers preferred companions that did not chatter. You pull the thread forward, smooth it once, and let the first length lie over the card before the needle rises. The wax holds the strand straight enough to show whether it has twisted, and if it curls back on itself, you pause to draw it between finger and thumb. It is easier to calm the thread before it enters the paper than to argue with it afterward. And that is another of the small lessons that repeats itself through the morning and afternoon. The table has marks from other kinds of work, shallow knife lines, a round stain from a hot pot, and a dark place where someone once spilled ink and wiped it too late. None of these marks belongs to button carding alone, but they make the surface feel inhabited, as though every trade leaves a little weather behind. When your card rests across those old marks, the new work and the old work share the same boards for a while, and the room feels less like a workplace than a long memory with hands in it. In BRNO's busy lanes, finished goods were often judged quickly by shopkeepers who had learned to see unevenness almost before they saw the object itself. A card of buttons might be lifted, glanced at, counted, and placed into a drawer within a few seconds, which meant the carder's long care became the customer's brief confidence. That is one of the strange economies of quiet labor, that many minutes of attention are spent so someone else may not have to spend any. There was a custom, especially with smaller white buttons, of breathing very gently across the card before the last inspection, not to warm it or polish it, but to reveal loose dust. A faint mist from the breath would darken stray lint for an instant, and the carder could flick it away with the corner of a cloth before it settled back into invisibility. It was not done over dark buttons, and it was not done when the room was cold enough to dampen paper, but at the right moment it helped the card look clean without rough handling. The cloth itself had rules that no one needed to write. One corner was for fingertips, one corner was for the tabletop, and one cleaner edge was saved for the front of cards that would be seen first in a shop. If all corners were treated alike, Grease and dust traveled quietly from place to place, and by evening every careful motion could undo another. So the cloth was folded with intention, and the fold became a small map of cleanliness. You notice the way a shell button answers the lamp differently when it is turned. One side may be plain as milk, while the other side holds a green shimmer like river water beneath cloudy ice, and this small difference can decide its place on a card. The customer may never know that the carder turned each button for its best face, yet the card will seem better somehow, more harmonious, more honestly sorted, as if the goods had arranged themselves. With cheaper buttons, the custom was sometimes reversed, and the worker did not waste too much time searching for the prettiest face. A work coat button, dark and serviceable, needed sound holes, a solid rim, and a surface without cracks that would cut the thread when worn. Beauty was not absent, but it stayed close to usefulness, and usefulness has its own low glow when it has been handled with respect. As daylight thins, the room's colors become simpler. Brown paper becomes brown shadow, blue guidelines fade towards gray, and black buttons lose their individual shine unless the lamp is turned slightly nearer. Someone at the far end of the table may lift the lamp by its handle and set it on a little block, raising the flame just enough to clear the curve of bent shoulders. This, too, is a custom that helped, because light that strikes too low makes every button cast a crescent shadow, and a crescent shadow can pretend to be a flaw. You keep the lamp chimney clean with a twist of rag when it cools, because soot on glass steals light from everyone. The act is careful and unromantic, a small housekeeping of illumination, and it makes the flame steadier when the evening work begins. In many rooms, the person nearest the lamp became its quiet keeper, trimming the wick, watching the smoke, and knowing when the glass had grown too dark for tired eyes. The printed cards sometimes came from local printers who served many trades at once, and their work carried the small pride of clear type and balanced borders. A maker's name, a size, a flourish, perhaps a line about durability or fine quality, would sit above the buttons like a modest shop sign. If the printing was slightly off-center, the carder had to compensate with the rows, placing the buttons so the whole face seemed balanced even when the paper itself had begun with a tiny mistake. That kind of correction is never recorded, but it belongs deeply to handwork. A worker sees what the material is doing and adjusts without complaint, saving the appearance of an object that arrived imperfectly from another bench. The printer, the cutter, the button maker, the thread supplier, and the carder all meet on the surface of one small card, and if everything goes well, their separate labors disappear into one plain useful thing. Some BRNO carders used a blunt awl or a thicker needle to prick starter holes in stiff cards before sewing through them. It saved the finer needle from bending, and it kept the paper from tearing when heavy coat buttons required stronger thread. The odd part was the rhythm of it, because the holes might be made across several cards at once, not through the stack, but one after another, in a dotted preparation that looked almost like a secret pattern before the buttons covered it. When starter holes were used, the carder had to be disciplined, since a hole made in the wrong place could not be unmade. The awl was lifted and set down with the gentleness of a pen, and the worker's eye moved along the guideline, as though reading a sentence. There is something soothing in a line of tiny holes awaiting its thread, because it shows the work one step ahead of itself, calm and prepared. For very small buttons, the needle alone was enough, but the holes in the buttons could be hard to find by lamplight. Some workers kept a pale dish beneath dark buttons and a dark dish beneath pale ones, making the holes visible by contrast before the button ever reached the card. It was a strange-looking habit to anyone passing by, as though the table had been arranged for color more than labor, yet it saved time and spared the eyes from endless searching. A tired eye begins to invent things, and carders knew this without needing a physician's language. It sees a hole where there is only shine, it misses a crack hidden along the rim, and it lets the last row wander because the mind has already gone home before the hands have finished. So the helpful customs gathered around the eye like a shawl, giving it contrast, rest, inspection, and gentle changes in work before strain became carelessness. There were moments when the city entered the room through smell before sound. Wet wool from nearby textile works, coal smoke hanging low between buildings, yeast from a baker's cellar, horse sweat in the street, and the metallic breath of tram rails after rain could all arrive together in the opened window. The carding table did not stop for these things, but the workers noticed them because repetitive work leaves part of the mind free to receive the world in small, passing portions. You might know the hour by footsteps on the stairs, or by the change in noise from the street, or by the way the room's warmth begins to draw dampness from coats hung near the door. A man delivering paper may come after the noon bell, a girl returning empty trays may come before dusk, and the same cough from the same neighbor may mark the turn toward evening. Time in such work is not only clock time, but pattern time, made from errands, flames, hunger, and light. When a new packet of buttons arrives, it is opened slowly over cloth, because a button dropped on bare boards can roll into a crack and vanish. Some packets are tied with string that has already been used once, and the knot is eased open rather than cut if the string still has strength in it. In a house or workshop that lives by small margins, even string is not merely string. It is a future bundle, a repaired wrapper, a temporary measure, a little length of saved order. A custom used by careful sorters was to spread no more buttons than could be carded before the next meal or lamp trimming. Too many loose buttons on the table invited confusion, dust, and the small grief of mixed sizes. A manageable portion, however, kept the work restful, because the eye could see the beginning and end of the immediate task, and the hand could move through it without feeling drowned in quantity. Piecework can make a mountain out of every tray, but the tray itself teaches a smaller truth. One card, then another, and the stack rises by the thickness of paper and buttons, almost too slowly to see. Only when you look after an hour do you notice that the finished pile has become substantial, with its edges squared and its string waiting, and the blank pile has lowered by the same patient measure. The body develops little ceremonies of relief. You flex the fingers beneath the table, not high enough to disturb the row, and press the thumb into the palm where the needle has left its memory. You roll the shoulders once while another worker reaches for thread, and you let your eyes rest on the dark square of the window where nothing needs aligning. Then the needle returns to the paper, and the ordinary rhythm resumes without announcement. Some carders kept a thimble, and some refused it for finer work, preferring the bare finger's judgment against the needle. A thimble protected, but it could make the touch blunt, while the uncovered finger knew exactly how much pressure the card would accept. If a thimble was used, it might be old, dented, and fitted to one finger as personally as a ring, with marks from years of pushing needles through cloth, paper, and small resistant things. The customs around sore fingers were humble and practical. A strip of linen might be wrapped around a tender place, or the needle might be held slightly differently for a batch of soft cards. In cold weather, hands were warmed over the stove before detailed work because numb fingers drop buttons and split paper, and a few moments of warmth can save many moments of repair. As the evening settles, the finished cards seem to take on more presence than the loose buttons. Loose buttons are possibilities, scattered and small, while carded buttons are promises, arranged and readable. They have been given count, direction, and a face for the shop, and this transformation, though modest, is the real work of the carder, who turns disorder into a kind of trust. A shopkeeper's drawer in the city might hold hundreds of these cards, each one sliding against the next with a papery sound. Customers would stand at the counter, asking for coat buttons, shirt buttons, black buttons, white buttons, something plain, something better, something cheap enough for a child's garment. The shopkeeper's fingers would walk through the drawers and lift the card by its edges, and all your care would be present there, though your name would not be. The anonymity of the work was not emptiness. It was simply the way many useful things passed through the world, shaped by hands that remained outside the story of purchase. A coat may be remembered, a dress may be admired, and a shop may be named by the street it stands on, while the carder's labor stays inside the small neatness that made the choice possible. Sometimes a card was prepared for a sample traveler, a merchant who carried goods from town to town in a case lined with compartments. For these cards, neatness mattered even more, because they might be shown in rooms with better light and handled by buyers comparing one supplier against another. A traveler's case had its own smell of leather, paper, dust, and railway smoke, and when opened, it unfolded like a portable counter full of order. Cards for travelers might be sewn a little more firmly, so they could survive repeated opening and closing, repeated fingers, repeated journeys over cobbles and rail lines. Yet they still had to look effortless, because over-fastened buttons suggested clumsy handling, and clumsy handling made goods seem cheap, even when the buttons themselves were sound. The carder therefore worked in the narrow space between strength and grace, a space known by touch more than by instruction. There was a curious practice of saving the best-looking card from a finished bundle and placing it on top, not to deceive, but to state the intended standard. The top card met the buyer first, and if it was square, clean, and balanced, it gave confidence in the stack beneath. But a reputable room did not hide poor cards below it, because trust, once damaged, traveled faster than goods and lingered longer than any single order. You align the bundle by tapping its bottom edge against the table, and the sound is soft because the buttons cushion the paper. The top card shifts a little, then settles flush with the others, and your hand passes over it in the old smoothing motion that began the day. This touch at the end resembles the touch at the beginning, and the circle of it is pleasing, as though the work remembers its own shape. In the colder months, workers sometimes placed finished bundles away from the window, because damp air could bow the cards or dull the shine of certain buttons. Near the stove was no better if the heat was too strong, so the best place was a middle shelf, dry but not hot, visible but out of the way. The room knew these places the way a kitchen knows where dough rises best and where herbs keep their scent. If a customer wanted cards wrapped for longer storage, a sheet of plain paper might be folded around the bundle before string was tied. The folds had to lie flat, with the string crossing where it would not press directly into a raised row of buttons. Such wrapping seems simple, and it is simple, but simplicity in old trades often means that many small failures have already taught people where the safe path lies. The night outside grows thicker, and the window reflects the lamp so clearly that it appears another carding table might be working in the dark beyond the glass. Your own moving hand is doubled there, faint and amber-colored, passing over the card as if another worker has come to help from the other side of evening. The reflection is only a reflection, of course, but tired minds accept gentle illusions when they do not ask for anything. The last packet for the day contains mixed dark buttons, and it requires sorting before any sewing can happen. You spread them on the pale cloth and separate them by size first, then by finish, because a glossy black beside a dull black can make both look wrong. Under the lamp, the differences appear and disappear, and the needle helps you nudge each button into its quiet family. Sorting can be more restful than stitching, because the motion is lateral and soft, not through paper, but across cloth. The buttons slide with a dry whisper, and the fingertip learns to tell a chipped edge from a smooth one before the eye confirms it. You make little groups, not piles too high, because piles hide things, and a hidden broken button will wait patiently until the worst possible moment to show itself. A custom among careful workers was to keep one rejected button from each flawed batch aside with the label, so the supplier could see the nature of the trouble. If many were cracked, the sample showed cracking. If the holes were poor, the sample showed that. If the color was uneven, the sample carried the proof. It was not accusation so much as accounting, another way the small trades kept fairness moving through rooms where no one had much time to argue. In a city of factories, disputes could be large, but many were settled through objects placed quietly on a counter. A broken button, a miscut card, a knotty thread, or a printed label with the wrong size could explain more calmly than a raised voice. The carder understood evidence through touch, and the merchant understood it through loss, and between them, the little flawed object carried its plain testimony. When the final good buttons are chosen, the rejected ones remain in a smaller dish, making a faint rattle when moved. They are not useless in every sense, because some may be kept for household repairs, hidden fastenings, children's practice, or rough garments where appearance matters less. Even rejection has degrees, and in a thrifty room, the word waste is used slowly, after the possibilities have been considered with patience. The cards for mixed dark buttons are thicker, and the needle must be pushed with care. You feel the paper resist, then yield, and the thread follows with a little sigh against the wax. The button settles into place, and the row begins, not as perfectly as the printed guide suggests, perhaps, but well enough to satisfy the hand, the eye, and the future drawer that will hold it. There is a meditative kindness in repeating a useful gesture after the day has grown old. The body knows it will soon stop, and because of that, each remaining card feels slightly more deliberate, more gathered. You do not hurry the end, because hurrying at the end is how a day loses its neatness, and a long day deserves to close as carefully as it opened. The room has fewer words now. Someone counts finished bundles, someone shakes crumbs from a cloth far from the cards, and someone closes a packet of unused buttons with the same string it arrived in. The stove shifts softly as coal settles, and the lamp flame leans when the door opens, then straightens again when the air becomes still. Before the table is cleared, the needle is wiped and placed where it will not be lost. Needles have a habit of vanishing into sleeves, cracks, paper stacks, and the dark seam between table boards, and every worker knows the unpleasant surprise of finding one later by touch. So the needle goes into cloth, cork, or a small case, and the thimble, if there is one, is set beside it like a tiny metal cup. Thread is not left trailing from the spool, because a loose end will tangle before morning or invite dust along its waxed length. You wind it once around the spool's body, tuck it beneath itself, and place the spool back into its cup. The gesture is quiet but satisfying, one of those closing motions that tells the hands the day's work has permission to become tomorrow's work instead. Blank cards are squared and covered, not because they are precious in a grand way, but because they must remain clean. Paper is always listening to the room, taking in damp, soot, grease, and fingerprints if given the chance. A covered stack wakes more kindly in the morning, and the carder who prepared it at night has already helped the carder who will sit down after breakfast. The finished bundles are moved last, since they carry the most labor and deserve the safest handling. You lift them from beneath, supporting the bowed places where buttons raise the paper, and set them into a box lined with packing paper. The box smells faintly of wood and old glue, and as each bundle enters it, the day's scattered motions become a single weight that can be carried down the stairs. In some rooms, the last custom was simply to look once more across the table before the lamp was lowered. Not a hurried search, not suspicion, but a slow sweep of the eyes for stray buttons, loose thread, a needle left bare, a card tucked beneath cloth, or a knot of wax fallen near the edge. The table, like a shoreline after the tide, could reveal small things when the work withdrew. You find one button near the lamp base, black and ordinary, almost hidden by shadow. It may have rolled there hours ago, waiting with the patience of small round objects, and now it returns to the rejected dish or the proper tray. A single saved button is not much, but it is still a button, still shaped, drilled, carried, sorted, and meant for use. And the hand is glad not to leave it behind. The lamp is turned down gradually because a sudden darkness would feel rude after so many hours of borrowed flame. The room softens, the hard shine leaves the buttons in the box, and the printed cards become pale layers rather than individual faces. Outside, BRNO continues in its evening way, with footsteps, wheels, smoke, and quiet voices passing under windows that have begun to glow one by one. You carry the box only a short distance, perhaps to a shelf, perhaps to a hallway where it will be collected, and the weight of it is not heavy, but definite. It is the weight of finished smallness, of rows and knots of countless choices made without fuss. In that modest weight rests the day, and the day feels less scattered now that it has taken a shape your arms can hold. The table cools quickly after the lamp is lowered, and the paper dust settles where the cloth has not yet passed. Someone covers the stove, someone folds an apron, and someone rubs the back of a wrist where thread has brushed all afternoon. The chairs are pushed in with care, not scraping if it can be helped, because the room has entered its quieter hour, and even wood seems to deserve gentleness. When you step away, the work remains visible in absence. The cup holds the spool, the cloth is folded, the blank cards are squared under cover, and the finished bundles wait with their strings, crossing like small roads. Nothing announces itself, yet everything says that hands have been here, arranging, correcting, noticing, and leaving order behind for morning. And morning will come again with the same kind of cold paper, the same waiting tray, the same lamp if the sky is dim, and the same first smoothing of the card beneath the heel of the hand. The customs will return because they help, and because useful customs do not need to be grand to endure. They only need to make the next motion easier, the next row straighter, the next hour more bearable. In that way, the button carder's craft continues, not as a story with a sharp edge, but as a long, low thread passing through paper, through time, and through the quiet places where ordinary work becomes care. By the next morning, the table remembers more than the mind does, because every object has returned to the place where yesterday taught it to belong. The cup waits for the spool, the cloth waits near the lamp, and the shallow dish waits for the first small rain of buttons from a packet loosened carefully at its seam. You sit down before the room has fully warmed, and the card beneath your palm feels cool, stiff, and faintly dusty, like something that has slept without dreaming. There is a custom for starting again after a finished order, and it begins with sorting the leftovers before touching the new work. The odd buttons, the cracked buttons, the unfilled cards, the saved scraps of thread, and the labels from old packets are laid out and judged one by one. It is not a ceremony in any official sense, yet it clears the mind as surely as sweeping clears a floor, because yesterday's fragments can whisper into today's work if they are left in a heap. The first new order might be for trouser buttons, plain and sturdy, the sort that no one admires until one is missing. They are thicker than shirt buttons, often darker, and their edges have a practical roundness meant for fingers that may be cold, gloved, hurried, or tired after work. These buttons are carded with more space between them, not for elegance alone, but so a buyer can lift one from the card without scraping a neighboring rim. You place them in a loose row before fastening, and they look almost heavy against the pale card. The printed line says where they should sit, but the buttons have their own opinions, because each one pulls the eye differently according to size and sheen. A carder learns to obey the printed guide without becoming its servant, making small corrections that allow the whole row to appear straight, even when the individual pieces are not perfectly alike. One BRNO custom, useful with heavier buttons, was to make a little bridge of thread rather than drawing the stitch so tight that the card bowed. The thread held the button close enough for travel, yet left a breath of space beneath it, so the paper did not pucker into a tired little hill. A tight stitch may feel secure in the moment, but paper remembers pressure, and by the time a card reaches a shop drawer, too much tightness can make it look worn. This is the kind of knowledge that grows slowly through the fingers. At first, a new carder may pull every stitch with the same force, trusting firmness because firmness seems safe. Later, after watching cards curl, holes tear, and knots rise where they should lie flat, the hand learns degrees of pressure, and the thread becomes less like a command than a conversation. The room is brighter now, with a pale band of morning lying across the table and making the waxed thread shine for a moment before it disappears through the card. Dust moves in that light, small and untroubled, and each drifting speck seems to be taking its own long time. You can hear the faint clack of distant looms through the walls of the neighborhood, softened by brick, weather, and distance, until the sound becomes almost like a low mechanical breathing. In the 1890s, BRNO's workdays were full of such layered sounds, with one trade audible beneath another, and one household labor folding into the next. A woman might card buttons in the same room where socks were darned, accounts were kept, soup was stirred, and a child practiced letters on a slate. Industrial life did not always stay in factories. It entered kitchens, back rooms, courtyards, and rented corners, where the smallest finishing tasks found whatever table was available. Because space was precious, another helpful habit was to keep each order inside its own shallow boundary. A folded cloth, a tray lid, a paper collar, or even 4 strips of scrap card could mark the edges of the work, so one size did not wander into another. This was especially useful when several orders shared the same table, and the difference between 2 button sizes could be felt only when they were placed side by side in good light. You learn to respect boundaries made from almost nothing. A line of paper scraps can save a morning from confusion, and a chipped dish can keep good buttons from mingling with rejects. The carder's table is not grandly organized, perhaps, but it is intelligently arranged, with each humble division preventing the kind of error that would take far longer to mend than to avoid. When the trouser buttons are finished, The next work may be tiny linen buttons, pale and nearly weightless, meant for underclothes, children's garments, or shirts. These call for a softer touch, because the card can dominate them if the thread is too thick or the spacing too proud. They seem almost shy on the paper, and the carder must make them visible without making them look crowded, which is another small balancing act hidden inside ordinary neatness. For tiny buttons, some workers kept a dampened fingertip wrapped briefly in cloth, not wet enough to mark paper, but just enough to lift a button that would not obey the needle. The habit looks strange when described because one imagines tools should do all the work, yet skin is often the finest tool in a room like this. The fingertip feels the button's edge, the cloth keeps it clean, and the card receives the piece without smudge or struggle. There were also customs about silence, though they were rarely spoken as rules. During the first card of a difficult batch, conversation often fell away by itself, because everyone understood that a new rhythm was being tested. Once the first row proved itself, talk could return in low streams, drifting around prices, weather, relatives, shopkeepers, and the small events of streets that changed slowly but never stopped changing. You might hear two languages in one story and understand it perfectly because the meaning rests in the gesture more than the word. A neighbor describes a merchant's frown by pulling her own mouth tight, then softens it with laughter, and the room receives the tale without needing every syllable. In a city where German and Czech and other voices pass through daily life, workrooms often became places where practical understanding ran ahead of grammar, following the thread of what had to be done. The buttons themselves might have traveled farther than the workers handling them. Some were made nearby, some came through Vienna or other trading centers, some were cut from imported shell, and some were pressed from new materials that promised economy and uniformity. By the time they reached the carding table, their journeys had been reduced to packets, labels, counts, and prices, but the surfaces still carried hints of river, animal, furnace, workshop, and sea. A shell button especially seems to bring distance into the room. It may have begun in warm water far away, then passed through cutting, grinding, drilling, polishing, sorting, packing, and transport before resting under your thumb in a cold BRNO morning. You do not need to think of all this while sewing, yet the button's pearly face holds a faint, far-off brightness, and the table feels wider because of it. One custom that helped with shell was to sort not only by size but by tone, so a card did not look patchy when held under shop light. Cream with cream, grey with grey, warmer pearl with warmer pearl, and the occasional bright piece saved for a card that could carry its shine without making the others look poor. This was not always possible in cheaper work, but when it was done well, a card of shell buttons had a calm, watery harmony that made customers linger. The sorting takes time, and time is always being counted somewhere. A clerk may count it by delivery, a merchant by sale, a worker by payment, and the body by the ache behind the thumb. Yet inside the act itself, time loosens a little, because sorting is a repeated seeing, and repeated seeing can become a quiet room within the room, where attention settles gently on one small difference after another. At the edge of the table, the beeswax has gathered lint. You scrape the outside lightly with the back of the needle, exposing a cleaner surface, and the wax releases its faint honey smell for a moment. That smell is warmer than the room deserves, and it seems to belong to summer fields rather than paper, thread, and industrial streets. Yet here it is, helping the thread pass smoothly through a winter task. Some carders used wax sparingly, because too much could leave a mark, or stiffen the thread into little kinks. Others used more when paper was rough or buttons heavy, and the choice depended on the batch, the air, the thread, and the memory of what had failed before. The best customs were never rigid, because materials are not rigid. They change with weather, quality, storage, and the tiredness of hands. When rain comes, paper behaves differently. The cards soften almost invisibly, the thread pulls with less crispness, and the edges may lift unless the stacks are weighted between tasks. On such days, a worker might card fewer stiff buttons and more light ones if the orders allowed it, or move finished work farther from the window, where damp air entered with the smell of wet stone and horse leather. The room seems closer in rain, and sounds arrive wrapped in water. Wheels outside hiss rather than rattle, Footsteps smear along the pavement, and the gutter makes a steady, private conversation with the street below. Inside, the buttons in their dishes sound drier by contrast, clicking softly against china or wood, and every click is contained by the larger murmur of weather. A useful rainy day custom was to place a sheet of waste paper beneath the wrist so the working cards stayed clean and dry. The wrist carries warmth, and warmth carries moisture, and over many hours even a careful worker can leave a dull place where the skin rests. The waste sheet absorbs what the good card should not, and when it grows tired, it is turned, folded, or replaced without fuss. You can feel the difference at once, because the wrist slides more freely, and the good card no longer clings faintly to the hand. The motion becomes smoother, and the needle finds its place without the small hesitation that damp paper can cause. Such a change is almost too minor to describe, but many old jobs are built from these almost minor things, each one saving a little effort, a little material, a little patience. In the afternoon, the order changes again, and now the cards are for mixed sets meant for household repair. These are not the finest goods, but they may be the most human, because every home has a jar, box, or folded paper of spare buttons, waiting for the day a cuff fails or a child's coat loses its fastening. A mixed repair card must look generous and sensible, not elegant, with sizes arranged so the buyer feels the card will answer more than one future need. The custom here is to put the most useful buttons in the most visible places, often larger ones near the center and smaller ones arranged around them. If the card has a printed border, the worker balances the shapes so the whole thing looks intentional rather than leftover. There is dignity in leftovers when they are sorted honestly, and a repair card can be a small household comfort, promising that not every mishap requires a new garment. You fasten the larger buttons first, letting them anchor the card like stones in a garden path. Then the smaller ones find their spaces, and the thread travels between them, in a route that must hold well without crossing the back too wildly. On the front, the card seems simple, but the back is a map of decisions, showing how the hand moved through irregularity and made it settle. These mixed cards reveal the carder's judgment more than uniform rows do. Anyone can see when 12 identical buttons stand evenly, but mixed goods ask for proportion, restraint, and a sense of what an ordinary buyer will find useful. Too many tiny buttons make the card seem mean, too many large ones make it awkward, and too much variety makes the eye suspicious, as though the card has gathered accidents instead of choices. The quiet skill is to make usefulness look natural. A buyer at the counter should not have to study the arrangement or wonder whether the card is worth its price. The hand should reach, the eye should agree, and the small future repairs of a household should feel, for a moment, a little more manageable. Near evening, a boy arrives with a message from the shop, and he stands by the door, careful not to brush the table. He smells of cold air and damp wool, and his boots leave 2 dark half-moons on the floorboards near the threshold. Someone reads the note, nods, and places it under a weight so it will not disappear among cards, because paper messages can vanish almost as cleverly as needles. The note asks for more black dress buttons by morning, and the room accepts the change with a small adjustment rather than complaint. Workrooms like this live by adjustment, by moving one packet forward, one bundle back, one set of hands from sorting to sewing, and one lamp nearer to the darker goods. The table shifts its attention, and soon the pale shell is covered, the mixed cards are stacked, and the black buttons come forward in their cool, shining dish. Black dress buttons ask for precision because their surfaces reveal uneven rows, and their purpose often carries a little more formality. They may be destined for bodices, jackets, morning wear, or respectable everyday garments that need darkness without dullness. The carder checks each one for chips along the rim, because a chipped black button catches light sharply, and a whole card can be cheapened by one bright wound. To inspect them, you tilt the dish rather than lifting every button. The lamplight runs across the surfaces, and damaged edges flash for an instant, making themselves known. This is faster than staring straight down and gentler on the eyes, which are already tired from the day's pale work and do not want to chase black holes through black shine. Another custom was to rest the eyes on the palm between dark cards. The warm plainness of skin, with its lines and soft color, gave relief from the hard reflections of glass or polished composition. It was a practical rest, lasting only a breath or two, yet it reminded the worker that eyes were part of the labor too, and deserved the same quiet care given to needles, thread, and paper. You sew the black buttons in rows of 6, the card held steady by your left hand, the needle rising and falling through the drilled holes. The thread disappears beneath the button, returns through paper, crosses the back, and comes forward again, each pass slightly easier, because the hand has found the angle. Outside, the lamps of the street begin to glow through damp air, and the city becomes a field of softened points, each one held in its own small halo. There is comfort in the fact that a row can be finished. Not everything in life offers such a clear edge, but a card does, and so does a bundle, and so does the moment when a knot is pressed flat and the thread cut cleanly. The satisfaction is modest, almost private, yet it gathers through the hours until the day has a quiet weight of completion. A senior carder may look over the first black cards and say nothing, which is often approval enough. If she sees trouble, she touches it with the needle tip rather than scolding, because the card itself can show the correction if the worker is willing to look. A row slightly high, a stitch too tight, a button turned dull side out, a back thread crossing too far, all these can be taught softly through the object without disturbing the room's calm. Teaching in such work is mostly a matter of nearness. The less practiced hand sits near the practiced hand, hears the rhythm, sees when the cloth is used, watches how often the spool is turned, and learns when to stop before a mistake becomes expensive. The knowledge passes sideways, table to table, not as a lecture, but as a weather of habits, settling slowly into whoever stays long enough. The evening order grows beneath your fingers, and the black buttons seem less difficult after the first few cards. Their shine becomes familiar, their holes easier to find, their small differences easier to forgive or reject. What began as strain becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes rest, which is why repetitive work can sometimes soothe even while it tires the body. By the time the last row is sewn, the room has gathered its night shape. The stove glows lower, the window is dark except for the lamp's reflection, and the finished black cards lie stacked with a seriousness that pale buttons never quite possess. You square the stack carefully and tie it with string, crossing the bundle where the pressure falls between rows. Not over them, because even at the end, the old custom still guards the work. The note from the shop is tied to the top of the bundle so it will travel back with the goods and explain why the order has been hurried forward. The knot is simple, not decorative, and the paper lies flat beneath it, obedient after being waited all afternoon. Someone will carry the bundle through BRNO's damp evening, past shuttered windows and late carts, and by morning it may sit behind a counter as if it had appeared there without effort. When the table is finally cleared again, a few pale shell buttons remain in the corner of the dark cloth, surprising as little moons after a night cloud passes. They are returned to their packet, because tomorrow may need them, and tomorrow is always closer than it seems in a room of unfinished orders. The cloth is shaken gently, folded inward so dust stays contained, and placed near the lamp for the next day's beginning. You look at your fingers, and the marks of the work are faint but real. A small dent where the needle rested, a dryness from paper, a trace of wax near the nail, and perhaps a dark speck of button dust caught in a crease. These signs will wash away, but not entirely before morning, and they make the hands feel connected to the day just completed. The room settles around its put-away tools. The cup is quiet, the dish is empty, the spool is tucked, and the blank cards wait under their cover like a stack of pale winter mornings. Outside, the city continues, but from here it sounds gentler now, softened by walls, by distance, and by the tired peacefulness that follows work done carefully enough. And if you stay a little longer in that room, with the lamp lowered and the table almost bare, you can still feel the rows that passed through the day. Trouser buttons, linen buttons, shell buttons, mixed repair cards, black dress buttons, each one held for a moment between thumb and needle before joining its proper place. They have gone into bundles now, into boxes, into the slow traffic of shops and households, but the rhythm remains behind, a fine thread of order drawn through the quiet evening. The rhythm remains in the boards after the hands have left, or at least it seems to, because rooms that hold repeated labor often keep a trace of motion inside their stillness. In the morning when you return, the table will not need to be introduced to you again, and the chair will know the bend of your knees before the first card is lifted. There is a kindness in that familiarity, a small mercy given by work that repeats without demanding surprise. On some days, the custom was to begin with the easiest order, not because it paid best, but because the hands needed to wake into accuracy. A row of medium horn buttons on sturdy card could bring the fingers back to their proper pressure, while difficult shell or black glass might punish the first stiffness of the morning. This was not laziness. It was the same practical wisdom that warms a tool before using it, or tests a pen before signing a careful name. The horn buttons wait in their packet with a faint earthy smell, not strong, but different from shell and glass. Their color is not one color, even when they are called brown or black, because horn carries small clouds, streaks, smoky patches, and amber places where the light thins through the edge. You pour them softly onto the cloth and let them settle, and for a moment they look like seeds collected from some patient, dark winter plant. Horn asks to be sorted by thickness as well as size, since a thick button beside a thin one can make a card feel unbalanced when stacked. The carder's fingers learn this before the eye does, lifting one piece and another, feeling their edges, setting aside the proud ones for a different row. On a good day, the sorting becomes almost pleasant, because each button has a little variation inside it, and variation keeps the mind gently awake without making it restless. A helpful habit with horn was to run the needle lightly through all the holes before sewing, especially when the drilling had left rough crumbs inside. The point cleared dust, discovered blocked passages, and warned the hand if a hole had been set too close to the rim. This saved thread, saved time, and saved the card from the small embarrassment of a button that refused to be fastened after its neighbors had already taken their places. You hold a button near the lamp and turn it until the holes show cleanly. Then the needle enters and passes through with a dry little touch, not sewing yet, only testing, and the button returns to the line with the others. This testing row looks like hesitation to someone who does not know the work, but to the carder it is preparation, and preparation is often the quietest form of speed. The supplier's label might say first quality, second quality, common, coat size, vest size, or some clerkly phrase that settles the goods into trade. But the carder must translate those words into the reality of the tray, where every batch has its own temperament. A second quality button may be perfectly serviceable if shown honestly, while a supposed fine button with poor holes can waste half a morning and teach everyone at the table to distrust printed claims. In the 1890s, paper labels, invoices, and factory marks carried more authority than they once had, yet the hand still verified what the label promised. That was one of the button carder's unglamorous duties, to let no written confidence pass untouched into the shop drawer. The work was not inspection in a grand official sense, but 1,000 tiny acts of looking, turning, feeling, rejecting, and accepting, each one keeping commerce a little more truthful. Sometimes the cards arrived already printed, with decorative borders that made the work harder rather than easier. A flourish in the corner could make a straight row seem crooked, and a bold maker's name could pull the eye upward, leaving too little quiet space for the buttons themselves. In such cases, the carder adjusted the row by feeling rather than measurement, placing the buttons where they looked calm on the whole face of the card, even if the ruler might disagree. This custom of trusting the eye did not mean guessing. It meant that the worker had seen enough cards to know when correctness and appearance were not exactly the same thing. A row can be mathematically centered and still feel wrong beside an uneven printed border, while a slight adjustment made by instinct and practice can make the whole card breathe more evenly beneath the gaze. The back of the card remains the place where the most private order lives. You turn it over, and the front's small shop window beauty becomes a network of thread crossings, knots, and little punctures in the paper. A careless back looks nervous, with thread wandering too far and knots lifting like burrs, while a careful back has the quiet logic of a swept path through a garden. Some carders mark the first card of a new pattern on the back with a tiny pencil line, not where a customer would notice, but where the worker could find the model later. The marked card became a memory aid, especially when an order stopped and resumed after another urgent bundle interrupted it. By returning to the model, the room could keep a batch consistent across hours, hands, and changes of light, which mattered more than anyone outside the trade might imagine. The pencil mark was small, sometimes no more than a notch near the lower edge or a faint line beside the knot. It did not advertise itself, and it was never meant to travel proudly through the world. It simply helped the worker return to the same spacing, the same thread path, the same count, and the same modest standard after the day had pulled attention in several directions. There were customs about sharing tools, too, because a room with several workers could not let needles, wax, or scissors drift like gossip. The scissors stayed in one place, often tied with a ribbon or string, long enough to use but short enough not to wander into a pocket. A missing pair of scissors could stop 3 hands at once, and the small frustration of searching beneath paper and cloth was worth preventing with a bit of string. The scissors themselves were not always fine. They might be slightly loose at the joint, darkened near the handles, and sharpened many times by someone who knew just enough to keep them useful. For carding, they did not need to cut silk. They needed to cut waxed thread cleanly, close to the knot, without pulling it into a ragged tail that would catch on the next card in the stack. You learned to cut with the tips, not the middle of the blades, because the tips can reach close to the paper without bending the thread. The sound is a soft tick, repeated hundreds of times but rarely noticed, unless the room falls very still. At day's end, those tiny cuts have completed as many decisions as the stitches themselves, because fastening is not finished until the excess has been removed with care. A curious custom, useful when thread colors changed often, was to keep the cut ends in separate little scraps, or at least sweep them away before changing from dark thread to pale. Dark lint on pale cards looked like dirt, while pale lint on black cards looked like damage, and both could invite complaint from a sharp-eyed shopkeeper. The carder did not need pride wounded by lint, so the table was cleared before the new color began. Clearing the table could become rhythmic in itself. The cloth was lifted at 2 corners, dipped inward, and carried gently to the waste dish, where loose ends and paper dust collected without scattering. Nothing was shaken too sharply near the cards, because a sudden movement could send sorted buttons rolling, and a rolling button can turn a peaceful room into a search party on hands and knees. There is a special patience reserved for finding a dropped button. Everyone listens first, because the sound tells its direction: a tap on wood, a tick against the chair leg, a faint roll toward the skirting board. Then the eyes lower, the hands still, and someone may slide a pale card along the floor to catch the glint beneath the table without stirring more dust. A dropped dark button under evening light can seem to vanish into the floorboards. The custom then is to wait for the lamp to be lifted rather than sweeping blindly, because a broom can push the button farther into cracks. When the lamp moves, the little object reveals itself, often closer than expected, and the room exhales in that mild way people do when a small disorder has been returned to place. The floor, like the table, becomes part of the trade. Cracks between boards are watched, loose knots avoided, and the space beneath the chair kept clear of cloth bundles that could hide fallen work. In poorer rooms, where the boards were uneven and the light unreliable, a sheet might be spread beneath the chair for expensive buttons, catching them before they reached dust, splinters, or the mysterious darkness under furniture. This sheet was never perfectly clean for long, but it was cleaner than the floor, and it made a small island of security around the worker's feet. Shell buttons dropped onto cloth made hardly any sound, which meant the carder had to glance down now and then, checking for pale pieces, resting like little flakes of bone. It was one more quiet habit, one more way the room adapted itself to the fragile economy of small things. Outside the window, BRNO's streets move through their ordinary changes, and the work table receives them as a distant accompaniment. Morning carts give way to errands, errands to deliveries, deliveries to homeward steps, and homeward steps to the deeper quiet after shops close. The carder does not watch the street constantly, but the street enters through sound and light, marking the hours more softly than any factory whistle. On market days, the noises are fuller, and the smell of food may reach the room before noon. Cabbage, bread, damp baskets, apples, smoke, wool coats, and animals all pass below, mingling with the carding room's paper, wax, and thread. The work goes on, but the city's body feels nearer, as though every button being sewn to a card is already on its way towards someone moving through that busy air. The buyers who would later use these cards were often careful with money, and the carders' work respected that carefulness. A card must not exaggerate value, but it must not make goods look mean either, because a poor presentation can make a useful object seem unworthy. Good carding finds the fair middle, where modest buttons appear honest, clean, and ready to serve without pretending to be more than they are. A repair button on a working coat may spend years unnoticed, carrying strain, weather, and the repeated pull of cold fingers. Its first public life, however, may have been on a card under your needle, held flat, counted, and tied into a bundle among others just like it. That small beginning gives the button a traceable order, a first resting place before it enters the disorderly usefulness of real garments. Sometimes, while fastening plain buttons, you think of garments not as fashion but as weather shelters made personal. Coats close against wind, shirts hold warmth near the skin, dresses move through doorways and kitchens, children's jackets take the shape of running and sitting and being lifted. A button is only a small fastening, yet without it cloth loosens, warmth escapes, and the body becomes more aware of the world's cold. This thought does not make the work grand, but it makes it tender. Each button card becomes part of the ordinary struggle to keep things whole a little longer, especially in households where repair is not a hobby, but a necessity. The carder's neat rows help someone choose quickly, mend cheaply, and return a garment to service, which is a humble and deeply practical kindness. Late in the week, the orders may include cards for seasonal goods, heavier dark buttons when coats are being prepared, lighter pale buttons when linen and cotton garments come forward. The carding room feels these seasons not through scenery alone, but through the weight and color of the trays. Winter brings more thickness, more darkness, more stiff cards and strong thread, while spring lightens the table with smaller, brighter, more washable things. In winter, hands warm slowly. The needle feels sharper, the buttons colder, and the thread less willing, until the room gathers heat from the stove and bodies at work. A custom then is to begin by rubbing the hands together with a bit of cloth, not roughly, but enough to bring life into the fingertips before they handle pale buttons that would show every mark. In summer, the problem changes. Fingers may grow damp, wax softens too easily, and paper can take the mark of a wrist or thumb before the worker notices. Then the cloth is used more often, the waste sheet beneath the hand becomes more necessary, and finished cards are moved away from the warmest patch of window light, where heat can bow paper and make stacked work feel tired. Every season teaches a different version of care, and the best carders carry all four versions inside their hands. They know the dry snap of winter card, the soft drag of rainy spring paper, the slight stickiness of summer thread, and the clearer, kinder light of autumn mornings when rows seem easier to judge. This is not written history, perhaps, but it is work history, held in habits that change with the year. The city's larger industries also have seasons, though they may be driven by orders, fairs, exports, and fashions, rather than weather alone. When tailors prepare for colder months, when shops restock after market days, when merchants anticipate holidays, the carder's table feels the change in packets and deadlines. The work remains the same motion, needle through paper, thread over button, not behind card, yet the pressure around it shifts like wind around a closed window. Even under pressure, the customs remain because pressure is when they matter most. The center first row prevents wandering, the back inspection catches looseness, the cloth corners preserve cleanliness, and the careful bundle tie protects finished work from being bruised by its own string. A rushed room without customs becomes noisy in the hands, but a rushed room with customs can stay almost calm, because everyone knows the next useful motion. You can feel this calm most clearly when several people work on one order. One sorts, one lays out, one stitches, one checks, and one stacks, the cards moving slowly down the table like quiet leaves on a narrow stream. No one needs to announce every step, because the materials themselves show what has been done and what remains, and the rhythm passes from hand to hand with ease. The sorter sets aside the flawed buttons without drama. The layer-out arranges the rows and adjusts the spacing by eye. The stitcher fastens them, the checker turns the card and reads the back, and the stacker aligns the finished pieces under a light weight until the bundle is ready. In this division, the carder is not always one person but a small chain of attention, each link saving the next from confusion. Yet a lone worker can do the same chain inwardly, shifting from one roll to another across the day. You sort in the morning, stitch after the kettle, inspect before the lamp is lit, and stack when the light has gone amber. The table may hold only one chair, but inside the work are several quiet selves, each with its own patience, each taking its turn. There is a custom of not trusting the first glance after lamplight begins. The eyes, having lived in daylight all day, need time to accept the warmer, smaller flame, and colors can lie during that change. Pale shell may look yellower, black glass may look sound when it is chipped, and brown horn may lose the subtle difference between warm and dull tones, so the carder waits, adjusts, and checks again. The lamp flame itself has to be persuaded into steadiness. The wick is trimmed flat enough to avoid smoking, the chimney set straight, and the lamp placed where its light falls across the card, rather than directly into the eyes. A bad lamp makes the work feel worse than it is, while a good lamp becomes almost invisible, lending sight without asking to be noticed. By evening, the carding room has become a world of small reflections. Buttons reflect flame, needles reflect flame, the scissors reflect flame along one worn edge, and the window reflects the whole room in softer, darker form. The worker's face appears there only faintly, bent and absorbed, less an individual portrait than part of the repeated shape of labor, which has leaned over tables in many cities and many years. The customs that helped were not unique to one room alone, and yet in every room they took on local flavor. In BRNO, where textile trades filled the city's industrial life, button carding belonged to a wider world of cloth finishing, mending, tailoring, shopkeeping, and domestic repair. The worker might never use the phrase supply chain, but she knew in her bones that poor carding could slow a shop, irritate a buyer, waste a maker's goods, and trouble a household's sewing. At the same time, the work was intimate enough to fit between a cup and a lamp. This mixture of industrial connection and tabletop closeness is what gives the job its peculiar calm. The city may be full of steam and ledgers, rail lines and factory bells, yet here the product passes through one needle, one thread, one card, and the measured pressure of a thumb. Some days bring a visit from the merchant or his clerk, and the room changes subtly before he enters. Not fear exactly, but a tidying of surfaces, a straightening of bundles, a more deliberate placing of the good cards where they can be examined. The clerk may smell of outdoor air, ink, and coat wool, and he may carry a notebook in which the work appears as numbers rather than rows. He lifts a bundle, fans the cards slightly, and checks the count. His hand is not as gentle as the carder's hand, because he does not know each stitch, and you may feel a small inward wish that he would support the stack from below. Still, a good clerk knows damage costs money, and after one careless bend, he learns to hold the cards more respectfully. The conversation stays practical. More of this size, fewer of that color, the black ones needed first, the shell delayed, the heavy cards to be sent before the end of the week. The carder listens not only to the words, but to the order behind the words, imagining how the table must be arranged after he leaves, which trays come forward, which threads are needed, and whether the lamp must be cleaned before the long batch begins. When the clerk departs, his footsteps go down the stairs and the room settles again, but differently. New priorities have entered, and the old order must be folded around them without losing its shape. This is another hidden skill of repetitive work, the ability to be interrupted gently, to adjust without scattering, and to return to the needle as though the thread had been waiting patiently through the human business of arrangement. A large order of black buttons means more eye rests, more cloth checks, and more careful lighting. A large order of shell means more tone sorting, more clean fingers, and perhaps fewer crumbs at the table. A large order of mixed repair cards means judgment, proportion, and enough space to see variety clearly, because usefulness can become confusion if it is crowded too tightly. The worker reads these needs through materials. The tray speaks in weight, the card in stiffness, the thread in drag and the room in light. No one outside may call this reading, but it is reading all the same. And the text is made of surfaces, resistance, warmth, and the small sounds of things touching things. As the week lengthens, the carder's body carries a map of repeated motions. The right hand knows the path from tray to card, the left hand knows how to steady without smudging, and the eyes know when to rise from the work before strain hardens into ache. Even breathing can fall into the pattern, longer during sorting, held briefly during a close stitch, released when the knot lies flat. The customs help the body stay kind to itself. The footrest prevents slumping, the cloth protects the wrist, the lamp spares the eyes, the center first row spares the mind from correcting a whole card at the end. Each custom is small, but together they make a shelter inside the work, and within that shelter, repetition becomes less like burden and more like rhythm. Sometimes, after many hours, you may find that you have finished a card without remembering each stitch. This is not inattention in the careless sense, but the deep familiarity of a task that has entered the hands. You look down, inspect the row, turn the back, and see that the work is sound, as if some quieter part of you had continued faithfully while thought drifted to rain, supper, or the sound of wheels below. There is peace in that, though it must be watched. A skilled worker can let the hands carry the easy part, but must return fully for the hard part, the flawed button, the rough hole, the misprinted card, the knot that catches. The custom of periodic inspection exists because trust and checking are not enemies. They are companions, each making the other safer. Toward the end of the day, a new girl at the table may ask why the first button is set in the middle rather than at the edge. The answer could be explained with words, but it is better shown with two cards, one begun at the corner and one begun from the center. The corner started row leans slightly by the end, hardly enough to condemn it, yet enough to make the center started card look calmer beside it. The girl nods, not because the rule is sacred, but because the reason has become visible. She will forget once or twice, as everyone does, and then she will see the row wander and remember with her own hands. This is how a custom becomes knowledge, not by being repeated as authority, but by proving itself quietly in paper, thread, and line. Another worker may teach her to leave the knot low by pressing it with the thumbnail before cutting the thread. A high knot looks like nothing on one card, but in a bundle of 20, it can mark the card above it, and in a box it can catch another thread. What seems harmless alone becomes troublesome in company, and many shop customs are really lessons about how objects behave when stacked, packed, and handled together. The stack is a strict teacher. It reveals bowed cards, raised knots, uneven buttons, too tight stitching, and careless tying more honestly than a single card does. A worker who understands stacking works differently from the start, because she is already imagining the finished bundle, the box, the journey, and the drawer where the cards must lie quietly among their neighbors. This forward imagination gives the repetitive task a gentle depth. You are not only sewing a button to paper, you are preparing the card to survive being stacked, carried, counted, unpacked, displayed, handled, and eventually undone. The present motion contains the future handling, and the future handling shapes the present motion, all within the small space beneath your fingers. The day closes with an order of white shirt buttons, and after so much dark horn and black glass, they seem almost luminous. They are common, but commonness does not make them simple, because white goods show dust, thread color, uneven holes, and every mark from careless touch. The carder washes or wipes the fingers, turns the cloth to its cleanest edge, and brings the pale cards forward like fresh linen. These buttons are light enough to shift when the thread brushes them, so you anchor each one gently with the nail before passing the needle through. The holes are small, the thread fine, and the row must remain delicate without looking weak. A card of white buttons should feel clean and orderly, like a folded shirt on a shelf, and the carder works toward that feeling through tiny restrained motions. There is a custom of breathing through the nose during the closest white work, not for discipline but to keep the card free of dampness. It sounds overly careful until one has seen a tiny spot appear on pale paper and refuse to vanish. The old workers did not need anyone to explain why they leaned back slightly before speaking over white cards. because experience had already made the rule plain. The white buttons gather in rows, soft against the card, and the room seems brighter around them. Even the lamp flame looks calmer reflected in their dull surfaces, less sharp than in glass and less mysterious than in shell. You finish one card, then another, and the stack rises like a small block of snow that has learned to be square. Outside, the evening street grows quieter. The carts pass less often, and the voices below turn from business to homeward talk, with doors opening, steps climbing, and kettles beginning their own household work. The carding table remains a little longer in its pool of lamplight because the last bundle must be completed before the cards can sleep under their paper cover. When the final white card is done, you turn it over and find the back acceptable, with no dark lint, no loose loop, no knot standing proud. The relief is small but real. It is the relief of not having to undo what has just been made, of seeing that patience has held through the last stretch and that the day has ended without losing its neatness. The bundle is tied loosely enough not to dent the pale buttons, and a clean wrapper is folded around it to protect the face from dust. You mark the order with a small written label, perhaps only size and count, then place it beside the darker bundles whose buttons make faint raised patterns under their paper bands. Together they look like the inventory of ordinary life. Coats, shirts, dresses, trousers, repairs, all reduced for the moment to rows on cards. The table is cleared again, but there is no emptiness in it. An empty work table after a completed day holds the opposite of emptiness. It holds the memory of order, made and sent away. The cloth lies folded, the tools rest, the lamp dims, and the blank cards wait, and the room seems to breathe out through its corners, letting the day's attention loosen at last. You stand with the box in your hands and feel the card bundles shift slightly inside, not loose, only settling. The weight is familiar now, neither heavy nor light, and it has the honest density of many small finished tasks gathered together. Downstairs someone may be waiting to take it, or it may rest by the door until morning, but for this moment it belongs to the quiet room and to the hands that filled it. The lamp is lowered, the window darkens, and the table becomes a shape rather than a surface. The day's last button, whichever one it was, has disappeared into its row, indistinguishable from the others except to the stitch that holds it. That is enough, because much of good work ends by disappearing into usefulness, and the button carders' customs, modest and strange and helpful, disappear with it into the calm order they helped create. In the morning, the disappeared work returns as a new order, because usefulness never stays gone for long in a city that dresses, mends, sells, and wears through cloth. A shop sends back empty wrapping, a clerk sends another note, and a packet arrives with buttons that look almost like yesterday's, though the hand soon discovers their differences. The routine begins again, not as repetition without meaning, but as a familiar doorway into the same small craft. This packet holds metal shank buttons, not flat pierced ones, and they change the table's mood at once. Instead of 2 or 4 holes on the face, each button has a little loop behind it, and the stitch must pass through that hidden bridge without letting the button swing loosely on the card. They are heavier, colder, and more talkative in the tray, making a small bright clinking when stirred with the needle. A custom for shank buttons was to lay them face down first, so their backs could be inspected before their shine distracted the eye. A bent shank, a rough solder, a loop set crookedly, or a sharp burr could cut thread or sit poorly against the card. Once the backs were judged, the buttons were turned face up and arranged by appearance, and only then did the sewing begin, because hidden faults travel just as surely as visible ones. You hold the first metal button between thumb and finger, feeling its coolness settle into the skin. The face is plain, perhaps darkened to look subdued, perhaps stamped with a faint rim, and the little loop at the back catches the thread like a gate. The card is thicker for this work, and when the needle passes through, the paper answers with a deeper resistance than it gives to linen buttons or shell. The stitch for a shank button is almost a tether. It must pull the loop close enough that the button lies still, yet not so hard that the card puckers or the metal bites through the paper during travel. A worker learns to make 2 neat passes through the shank, sometimes 3 for heavier pieces, then settle the thread behind the card with a knot pressed flat by the thumbnail. These cards do not stack as kindly as flat button cards. The shanks raise the buttons slightly, and if the bundles are pressed without care, the faces can mark the cards above them or shift against their thread. So another custom appears. Shank button cards are stacked in smaller bundles, sometimes with a scrap sheet between them, and tied where the string falls through the spaces instead of across the metal faces. The scrap sheets may be old wrappers, misprinted cards, or the backs of paper that once carried a merchant's figures. Nothing too dirty, nothing with ink that might rub off, and nothing so thick that the bundle grows clumsy in the box. A good scrap sheet is almost invisible in the finished bundle, doing its protective work quietly, like padding under a winter coat. As you stack these heavier cards, the box makes a different sound. Flat shell cards whisper, white shirt cards sigh, but metal shank cards settle with a muted clack, softened by paper yet still carrying their small hardness. The ear comes to know these differences, and a worker can sometimes tell from the sound alone whether a bundle has been stacked too roughly or tied too tight. On damp days, metal buttons feel colder than the room itself. They seem to borrow chill from the morning and keep it beneath their faces, so the fingertips wake with each piece, as if touching a little coin from an unheated drawer. The stove helps after a while, but the first hour belongs to cold metal, pale card, and the patient warming of hands around repetitive motion. Because metal can tarnish, some carders handled it with a cloth more often than with bare fingers, especially when the buttons were polished or darkened in a finish that showed marks. The cloth did not need to be fine. It only needed to be clean, dry, and free of the thread lint that could cling to raised rims. A button might be lifted in the fold of the cloth, set in place, and then steadied with the nail while the needle found the shank. Such care might seem excessive for a common fastening, but presentation had its own economy. A tarnished card could be discounted, a smudged card could be rejected, and a scratched card could make an honest batch look old before it reached the counter. The carder's customs protected not only beauty, but payment, trust, and the quiet pride of sending work out as cleanly as circumstances allowed. By mid-morning, the metal order gives way to covered buttons, those small fabric-faced pieces meant to match or soften a garment. They arrive differently, wrapped with more caution because cloth faces can catch dust, crush under pressure, or darken where a damp finger has touched them. The carder changes posture almost without thinking, sitting a little straighter, clearing the cloth, and making the table feel gentler. Covered buttons are nearly silent in the tray. They do not click like glass or ring like metal, and when they brush together, the sound is a soft, dry hush, closer to clothing than hardware. Their fabric faces may be black, brown, grey, or a subdued color meant for a dress or bodice, and because cloth absorbs light, their arrangement depends on shadow as much as shine. A useful custom with covered buttons was to brush the card lightly before beginning, because a speck of dust trapped beneath a fabric button could rise later as a little unevenness. The brush might be a soft scrap of cloth, a worn bit of clean flannel, or even a small feather kept for the purpose. You pass it over the card once, slowly, and the paper seems to become not cleaner in a dramatic way, but more ready. The stitch must not pull the cloth face out of shape. If the shank is fabric covered too, the needle must find it by touch, passing under the loop without snagging threads or twisting the button. The carder's hand becomes careful in a different register, not protecting shine now, but protecting softness, and the whole task seems to ask for a quieter pressure than the metal order before it. There were customs about which work followed which, though they depended on orders and could not always be obeyed. Some workers liked to do soft covered buttons after metal, because the change eased the fingers and calmed the ear. Others preferred not to switch from dusty horn to pale fabric without clearing the table fully, knowing that one dark crumb can lodge on a cloth face and sit there like a tiny accusation. You clear the table before covered buttons. The dark cloth is shaken far from the cards, the waste paper is replaced, and the scissors are wiped at the tips where waxed thread has left a faint dullness. These motions take time, yet they save time later, which is the hidden arithmetic of nearly every practical custom in the room. A clerk might not record table clearing as labor, but the worker knows it belongs to the work. The blank card does not care whether dust came from horn, thread, coal smoke, or yesterday's bread. It only shows the mark. So the carder becomes guardian of a small cleanliness, not spotless, not precious, but adequate to the dignity of objects meant for sale and use. At noon, light reaches deeper into the room, and the covered buttons show their nap, the slight direction of fabric that makes one side appear darker than another. A careful worker turns them so the nap lies the same way across the card, or at least so the differences do not quarrel. This is one of the oddest and most helpful customs, because a row of matching fabric buttons can look mismatched if each face catches light from a different direction. To find the nap, you tilt the button and stroke it lightly with the side of the needle or the cloth edge. One direction smooths it, another lifts it, and the change is so slight that only a practiced eye would trouble over it. But once all the faces lie kindly together, the card looks calmer, and calmness is often the sign of hidden labor done well. Covered buttons also bring thoughts of the garments they may join more strongly than other kinds. A metal button can belong to many things, a horn button to coats and trousers, but cloth-covered pieces seem already halfway sewn into a dress, jacket, or bodice. They carry a domestic quiet with them, as though the carding table has borrowed a little hush from wardrobes, bedrooms, and carefully folded cloth. The meal break comes with the covered buttons half finished, and they are covered in turn before anyone eats. A sheet of paper is laid gently across the arranged but unsewn row, not pressing, only guarding them from crumbs and wandering air. The habit may look fussy, but it keeps the afternoon from beginning with dust, and it gives the worker the comfort of returning to a table that has held itself in order. Bread is broken away from the cards. Soup, if there is soup, is held in bowls near the stove, not above the table, and spoons make a rounder sound than buttons do. The talk grows a little warmer over food, though still unhurried, and the covered buttons wake beneath their paper with the patience of things that have no wish to be noticed before their time. When work resumes, the hands are wiped more carefully than hunger would like. A grease mark on a covered button cannot be polished away like a mark on glass, and a damp fingerprint on card may dry but still leave a dull memory. The carder learns to bring the body back from meal to work through cloth, water, apron, and a few moments of restraint. The afternoon order involves cards for children's buttons, small bright pieces, some colored, some shaped, some meant less for elegance than for cheerful usefulness. These can be difficult in a different way, because variety must be controlled without removing the small pleasure that makes them sell. The carder arranges them so color does not gather heavily in one corner, and no odd shade seems abandoned at the edge. A custom for colored buttons was to set them first on a neutral cloth and let the eye rest before deciding. Under lamplight, blues could darken, reds could thicken, and greens could lose their gentle difference from brown, so daylight was preferred when possible. If daylight was not generous, the worker held the card nearer the window, even on a dull day, trusting the sky more than the flame for color. Children's cards might include little flower-like shapes, tiny discs, or buttons with molded rims that caught dirt if handled too much. They made the table briefly livelier, though the room's rhythm stayed low. You sort them by size, then by shade, then by the practical question of which ones will look friendly together without making the card seem like a spilled sweet box. The work is still repetitive, but colored buttons invite a softer kind of judgment. Too much regularity can make them stiff, while too little makes them careless, and the carder finds the middle by arranging, pausing, and looking again. The best card seems to have been easily gathered, although ease is exactly what the careful arrangement has created. Some cards are made for 6 buttons, some for 12, some for a larger count that fills the paper in close rows. Every number changes the spacing. A 6-button card can leave generous air, while a 12-button card must be orderly without seeming crowded. And a larger card requires the worker to think of columns and rows as a single pattern rather than a series of isolated stitches. Even numbers are helpful because they divide neatly around a center line. Odd numbers require a different eye, and the central button becomes a kind of anchor, setting the tone for the rest of the card. Workers may not speak of design, but they design all the same, placing objects so the eye moves through them peacefully. As the afternoon light leans, the room becomes drowsier, and the colored buttons lose some of their morning liveliness. The carder's motions slow slightly, not from idleness, but from the natural caution that comes when eyes have worked for hours. This is when customs matter again. Inspect the back, rest the eyes, clear thread ends, check the count aloud only softly, and never trust the last card simply because it is last. There is a mild temptation at the end of any small batch to forgive what would have been corrected at the beginning. A crooked button seems less crooked when supper is near, and a loose thread seems almost acceptable when the lamp needs tending. The old workers knew this temptation well, so they made the final inspection a habit rather than a decision, and habit carried them past the weak places of tiredness. You turn the last colored card over, and the back shows one loose crossing. It would probably hold, but probably is not the same as properly, and the difference lies close to the heart of this work. You ease the thread, reset the stitch, press the knot, and only then does the card join the stack, bringing with it the small relief of something not left doubtful. The next day brings printed novelty cards from a merchant who likes a little flourish. The cards have decorative corners, perhaps a border with tiny leaves or a name printed in a proud curve, and the buttons must be placed so they complement the printed face rather than fight it. Decorative cards are pleasing, but they leave less room for correction, because the printed ornament makes every misplaced button look more deliberate than it is. A custom with decorative cards was to lay a blank guide strip beneath the first row, hiding the border for a moment so the spacing could be judged without distraction. Once the row was set, the strip was removed, and the worker checked whether the buttons and printed design had made peace with each other. It is a simple trick, almost comic in its modesty, yet it lets the eye do one task at a time instead of being tugged by too many lines. You slide the strip away and see the rows settle into the whole card. The buttons are not grand, perhaps dark glass or smooth horn, but on the printed card they acquire a little shop window confidence. Presentation has changed them, not falsely, but by giving their usefulness a clean stage, and the carder has helped create that stage one stitch at a time. There is always a question of how much thread should show. Some merchants prefer the button faces almost untouched, with thread hidden as much as possible, while others want a visible crossing that reassures the buyer the buttons are firmly attached. The carder adjusts to these preferences, keeping them in memory besides sizes, materials, and the habits of different shops. This memory becomes a private ledger that may never be written. The shop near the square wants black cards tied in small bundles. The wholesaler by the station accepts larger stacks. The careful clerk checks the backs, and the hurried one counts only the fronts until a complaint teaches him otherwise. Each customer's habits return through the orders, shaping the work from a distance, like a hand resting lightly on the far end of the table. By the 1890s, printed trade names mattered more and more, and a good card could make even ordinary buttons feel part of a reliable house. The carder, though rarely named, helped protect that reliability. A maker's name printed above crooked rows suffers, while the same name above clean spacing and flat knots seems steadier, more deserving of the buyer's small trust. The work therefore sits between manufacture and reputation. It does not make the button, but it prepares the first impression, and first impressions travel quickly in shops where customers compare cards by sight, touch, and price. A carder may never meet the manufacturer, yet her thread helps carry the manufacturer's promise into public view. In quiet hours, the repeated movement can feel almost like copying script. The needle writes through paper, the thread forms hidden lines, and the buttons become words arranged in rows that say enough, sound, clean, counted, ready. The customer reads that message without hearing it, and the carder writes it without ink. Some workers disliked batches with too many sizes mixed together because the hand had to change its motion again and again. Others enjoyed them, finding that variety kept the afternoon from thickening too much. You may feel both things at once, the comfort of sameness and the relief of change, as one card asks for firm pressure and the next asks for a touch light enough to leave no trace. A small bell from the street may mark a vendor passing. The sound rises through the window, moves across the room, and leaves without altering the needle's rhythm. It reminds you that goods are moving everywhere, not only buttons, but bread, coal, milk, cloth, paper, nails, candles, and all the small necessities by which a city keeps itself in motion. The carding table belongs to that movement, though it seems so still. Goods arrive loose, and leave arranged. They arrive mute and leave labeled. They arrive in packets and leave ready for drawers, counters, baskets, and hands. The work is not loud, but it participates in the city's long exchange of need and usefulness, which continues beneath all the day's separate sounds. A custom for the late afternoon was to count the finished cards before tying, then count them once more after tying, because bundles can deceive the eye. A card may cling beneath another, or a thin card may hide between thicker shank cards, and a mistaken count can travel all the way to a shop before being discovered. Counting twice is slower only when the first count was right, and faster when the first count was wrong. The count is murmured, not announced. 1, 2, 3, and onward. Each card lifted slightly or touched at the corner, the bundle growing more certain with every number. When the count agrees with the label, the string crosses, the knot is made, and the worker feels a small inward settling, the kind that comes when the world has matched itself to what was written. Labels are humble things, yet they hold authority. A wrong label can make good work troublesome, while a clear label lets everyone after you move more easily. So the carder or clerk writes size, count, material, and sometimes destination, using a steady enough hand that evening tiredness does not turn a simple figure into a question. When labels are tied on, they should lie flat. A curling label catches on neighboring bundles and can tear, and a torn label makes a box less trustworthy. Some workers rub the label lightly over the table edge to soften its curl before tying it, and this small odd habit kept paper obedient during travel. As the box fills through the week, its contents become a quiet record of local needs. More coat buttons when the weather cools, more shirt buttons when shops restock basics, more black dress buttons when fashion, mourning, or simple practicality asks for them. The carder may not read newspapers often, may not attend trade meetings, yet the table receives hints of the larger world in the shapes and colors it must arrange. There are days when an order is delayed because the cards have not come from the printer. Then the buttons wait, sorted and ready, with nowhere proper to go. The room feels slightly unsettled by such waiting, because a button without a card cannot be finished into sale, and a worker with prepared hands must turn to another batch while the delayed paper makes its slow way through town. When the cards finally arrive, still smelling faintly of ink and cutting dust, they are inspected before use. Fresh ink can smudge if it is not dried well, and card edges can carry little paper hairs from a dull blade. The carder runs a thumb along the edge, brushes away the loose fibers, and gives the new stack time near the room's air before pressing buttons onto it. Printer's ink has a smell that mingles strangely with wax and buttons. It is sharper than paper, darker than cloth, and it makes the cards feel newly official, as though the blank spaces have been given instructions before the worker begins. You smooth the top card and feel the printed letters faintly raised beneath the heel of the hand, a reminder that other hands and machines have already touched this work before yours. Some cards are cut imperfectly, with one side a little wider, one corner not quite square, and these must be turned consistently so the floor does not wander through a bundle. If every card leans the same way, the stack looks intentional. If each card leans differently, the bundle looks careless. It is another quiet correction made by the worker, who sees not only the single card but the family it will join. There is a comfort in making families of things, buttons of the same size, cards of the same cut, bundles of the same count, boxes of the same destination, all gathered from loose variety into a sequence the hands can understand. The work does not erase difference, but it gives difference a place to rest, and that may be why the table feels calmer as the day goes on. Near the end of the week, the room may prepare a larger shipment and the final customs become broader. Boxes are checked for splinters, lining paper is folded into the corners, heavy bundles go below, lighter ones above, and labels face upward where the clerk can find them without unpacking everything. The carder's care extends beyond the card now, into the box, because a careless box can undo careful rows before they reach the shop. You place the bundles in layers, alternating direction when needed, so the raised buttons do not all press into one place. The lining paper folds over the top like a blanket. The lid comes down slowly, not forced, and if it does not close easily, The contents are rearranged rather than crushed, because no amount of hurry can make damaged goods arrive undamaged. The box waits by the door with a cord around it, and the room seems to grow larger once the table is cleared of the week's accumulation. There is still dust, still thread, still the warm, dull smell of the stove, but the main weight of work has moved into the box. It sits there with its quiet authority, holding many hours in a shape simple enough to carry. When someone lifts it, the contents shift slightly and then settle. The sound is layered, paper against paper, buttons beneath paper, string against card, and perhaps one metal shank card answering softly from the lower corner. The carrier adjusts his hands and takes it away, and the room is left with the sudden lightness that follows any completed shipment. That lightness does not last long, but it is pleasant while it stays. The table is wiped more fully, the cloths are examined, the dull needle is replaced, and the wax is set near the stove just long enough to soften its scraped surface. This weekly restoring is a custom too, less about production than renewal, and it gives the next week a cleaner beginning. You may find tiny histories while cleaning: a shell flake caught in the grain of the wood, a black thread end clinging to a table leg, a pale button chip beneath the cup, a pencil mark rubbed almost away on a scrap guide. Each little remnant belongs to work already gone into the world, and clearing it is not erasing so much as making room for the next quiet arrival. By dusk, the table stands nearly bare. The lamp has not yet been lit, because the day's work is done early for once, and the window holds the last grey-blue light over the city roofs. In that interval before evening fully enters, the room feels suspended, as if even the stove has lowered its voice to listen to the absence of needle and thread. You rest your hands flat on the table, and the boards feel smooth in some places, rough in others, warm near where the lamp usually stands, cooler at the far edge. The hands know the day through touch, and even without a card beneath them, they remember the spacing of rows, the pull of thread, the resistance of paper, and the small obedient settling of a knot pressed flat. Nothing more needs to happen for a moment, and the pause is part of the work's own breathing. Later, when the lamp is lit for household tasks rather than carding, the table becomes ordinary again, or almost ordinary. A cup may be set where buttons stood, bread may be sliced where cards were inspected, and someone may lean an elbow in the place where the finished bundles rested. Yet the table remains quietly doubled, because work and home have shared it so closely that neither fully leaves when the other arrives. This is how many obscure jobs lived, not in grand separation, but braided into daily rooms. Button carding could be industrial and domestic, commercial and intimate, repetitive and oddly delicate, all at once. Its customs helped because they belonged to real constraints: dim light, damp paper, tired eyes, small payments, fragile materials, mixed languages, changing orders, and the unending need to make useful things look trustworthy. The city outside settles into night. BRNO's factories grow quieter or change shifts. The streets lose their market noise, and windows become small rectangles of private flame. Somewhere, a shopkeeper slides finished button cards into drawers, perhaps without thinking of the hands that placed each one, and somewhere else, a person searches a basket for a matching button, grateful only that the card is clear, counted, and easy to use. That is enough for the carder. Not fame, not applause, not a place in a large account of industry, but the knowledge that rows have been straightened, faults have been caught, and small goods have been sent forward in better order than they arrived. The customs did not make the work effortless, but they made it possible to do well, and sometimes possible to do peacefully. The lamp flame lowers. The cloth is folded with its clean corner tucked inward. The needle rests where it can be found, and the wax waits with a dull golden side turned toward morning. The room is not empty, because tools at rest still carry the shape of use, and the table, cleared of cards, seems to hold the whole day lightly in its grain. Outside, the last cart of the evening passes slowly over the stones, and the sound fades into the street's deeper hush. Inside, the button trays are covered. The box space by the door is bare, and the finished work has gone on ahead into the ordinary paths of trade and mending. You stand there a moment longer, breathing in paper, wax, faint coal smoke, and the tired, clean scent of cloth, while the quiet customs of the button carder gather themselves for sleep.